Good afternoon, Anthony. In our podcast today, we're going to make some unusual links between the peacock's tail, deer antlers, and Ferraris. And we'll also be throwing in a new word into the mix to make the links more understandable. Looking forward to it.
Yes, I am too. And the new word for listeners to keep you out of suspense is prodigus, Prodigous, not to be confused with prodigious, which has a soft G and an I, and not to be confused with prodigal, as in prodigal son. But the word prodigus is derived from the same Latin root as prodigal, as in prodigal son. And as we'll explain, it fills a kind of a hole in the biological lexicon, allowing us to think more clearly about a certain phenomenon in nature. And that is, why do certain organisms, such as the peacock or the giant Irish elk, have body parts that seem unreasonably extravagant, particularly in comparison with closely related organisms that seem to get by perfectly well without that kind of extravagance? And the word extravagant doesn't really fit the bill. That's why we've had to come up with the word prodigus, because all the words in the English language like extravagance. There's about 10 of them, 10 synonyms. They've all got moral overtones. They all imply a kind of a sinful wastefulness of resources, which is not appropriate for the rigorous and objective investigation of science. And so we want to be able to name something in science, in biology, as being puzzlingly expensive in a kind of what seems to be an unnecessary way in order to figure out the costs and benefits of the organism and to figure out why it is actually adaptive to spend so big on something that seems frivolous or redundant or excessive or unnecessary. Anthony, there's no sound.
Sorry, I was on mute there. The concept being a common one in biology textbooks, that organisms are exquisitely adapted using cost-benefit equations over time, over evolutionary time, such that any expenditure of energy can never be deemed wasteful. It's always achieving something, not so.
Well, biologists pay lip service to that idea. I mean, okay. From the point of view of a purist, a scientific purist, a biological purist, somebody with a very rigorous mind, it should be sort of axiomatic that nothing in biology is accidental. Because you see that the moment you open the door to accidental things, then the question arises, why isn't everything accidental? Because you can't draw a line between the accidental things and the things that actually matter adaptively. So if you come to the peacock's tail and somebody says, well, that's just an accident of the genetics or the history or the ecology, and it doesn't really have to be explained, well, that's very convenient and very easy. But then I'll simply ask you, well, why doesn't a Cape francolin also have an expensive tail? Because unless you can reconcile those things in terms of actual objective reality of real costs and benefits, real advantages and disadvantages, then you don't have a science. You've just got a bunch of arm waving. You have to explain the peacock's tail objectively in terms of cost-benefit analysis or risk-benefit analysis in order to be practicing biology. And so the word prodigusness puts a label on certain phenomena in nature that seem extravagant in quite a reasonable way by pointing at closely related organisms that simply don't do that. And one of the best examples is, if you look at many species of deer around the world that have these extravagant bony trees that grow every year on their heads and then are then shed, only to be regrown the next year at great expense of energy, protein, phosphorus and calcium and so on. It seems unnecessary. That's why we call it prodigus, because you have other very closely related organisms like the Indian nilgai, an antelope in India, that is so frugal in terms of its head adornments that it basically has no horns to speak of. And instead of undergoing the kind of elaborate antler-based sparring rituals that deer males go through, instead it simply neck wrestles It still has intense male rivalry, but it doesn't need any head adornment, let alone an antler, because it just neck wrestles. So the question then arises, well, if neck wrestling is a way to sort out your masculine rivalry and your sexual selection, then why on earth do some ruminants engage in the kind of flagrant extravagance, as it were, that results in them devoting as much calcium and phosphorus to their head adornments over a lifetime as their mates are devoting to milk for their offspring? It just seems to be, and you see already in the way that I've described it in conventional English language, it has moral overtones. It sounds like I'm judging the deer for being wasteful, sinful, prodigal, and so on. But but it's obviously not, because it's surviving perfectly well that way. And so we need a noun and an adjective in formal science to describe that apparent wastefulness. And so we have prodigus and prodigousness.
Yes, wonderful. And it's theoretically, it's that word, defining that word is going to help us with the mystery, with unraveling this mystery of why does the chital deer in India grow this head of this tree of calcium phosphate every year, but the nilgai doesn't. And as I understand it, your take right now is the mystery is fully intact. There really isn't even a good hypothesis right now. And I would think that the nilgai has a similar availability of energy and is just deploying it in a different way. So per gram of biomass, the nilgai is still generating as many ATP molecules as the chital deer. And the chital deer is taking some of those ATP molecules to create its antlers, and which it sheds and then recreates. And I'm saying, well, the nilgai is taking that same proportion of ATP molecules and spreading it out across a range of things that we can't really see, that also provide benefits, but those benefits are just less tangible. Perhaps it's just because it's a slight improvement in all organ function relative to the chital deer, and it's close to impossible. Right now technology is not available to show that difference between the chital deer and the nilgai, but there is such a difference, because otherwise evolutionary biology doesn't make any sense, and biogeography theorizing doesn't make sense. If we believe in convergent evolution, well then by definition that has to be so. Would you agree or not?
Well, I agree within the framework that you've provided, but you see, if you stand back and adopt a slightly wider framework, I'll show how it's not necessarily the case that all organisms are commanding resources to the same degree. Now, before we go on, just for the benefit of listeners who are not completely familiar with the animals we've cited, we're talking about the nilgai, which is an Indian bosselafin bovid by the name of Tragocamelus, Bosselafus tragocamelus, and then we're also talking about the Indian spotted deer, or chital, the scientific name of which is axis. Now, moving out of your frame into a northern hemisphere frame to illustrate a different perspective on how one organism can spin bigger than another, consider a population of mule deer in North America. Now, this is in a snowy climate, and in the wintertime, conditions are so harsh that the metabolism goes into sleep mode. The animals yard in the snow. They cut down their activities. They hardly forage. They just kind of eke their way through the winter, because in winter there's essentially starvation conditions for the mule deer, Rocky Mountain mule deer. And what that means is that under those conditions, the population density of the mule deer in a given area is set by the winter stricture. And so you can only have so many females, regardless of how abundant the forage is in the summer, because your population level is set by the winter stricture, right? And I realize this doesn't apply to India, but I'm trying to illustrate a certain framework here. Now,
Sure.
in the spring and the summer, that same environment in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains becomes unbelievably lush. And you go from near starvation to more food than you can eat. And it's only temporary food. And so if you don't eat it, it just goes to waste.
Yeah.
And so what the mule deer does then is all things being equal, it would like, as it were, for the females to use that to reproduce, because that's the way that the species can do best. But the females can't, because there's only so many of the females, and they can only produce so many young and produce so much milk. And so that excess seasonal abundance of green forage reasonably goes into the males. And what happens in the Rocky Mountain mule deer is the males forage in one area in the summer, and their females and young forage in a different patch. And so there's no competition between them at any level, and they're both chowing as fast as they can. The females are productively converting that into milk, and the babies are the juveniles are productively converting that into flesh and bone. But the males are off somewhere else on almost the same rich pasture, and what they're doing instead is they're growing bony trees on their heads, because why wouldn't they? Because all that forage, all that phosphorus, all that calcium, all that protein, all that energy is available and going to waste. And so there's no real conundrum about why the Rocky Mountain mule deer grows a series of trees on its head each year for the whole of its life, because why wouldn't it, given that its females cannot use up all the food? And so when you look at deer through that lens, the apparent prodigiousness of the antlers of the mule deer are quite understandable, really, and not that much of a biological puzzle. But the problem is that deer exist in other environments, such as the tropics in both India and South America, where no such seasonal abundance occurs. Yeah. There's no such seasonal abundance in the savannas of India that would explain why you have an antler-bearing animal in the form of a cheetal, whereas in similar environments in Africa, you have an impala, which has a very modest budget of expenditure for its head adornments that are permanent and quite small. And so that's the puzzle, you see. But the point I was trying to make was that it's not necessarily the case that the nilgai is using up as much resource as its counterpart, the cheetal, because we know that in some instances, deer can be extremely consumptive on the male side just simply because it's affordable. There's nothing better to do with it than that.
Yeah. Does the shedding of antlers indicate that nature abhors a vacuum is not a very good concept? Because that nature abhors a vacuum implies that all energy available for organisms should be utilized. Feels like there should be some other organism in there seizing the opportunity and creating a new life form, rather than having the deer grow these antlers.
Yes, well,
using those resources.
I understand, and that's why I've spent quite a while studying the rodentiforms in North America to try and figure out how they, as well as the grouse and the geese, all fit into the whole foraging guild.
Yeah.
But for various reasons, it seems like the deer are the most competitive, at least in their habitat. You know, there are other habitats in North America where rodentiforms, including hares and marmots, are competitive. And there are some environments in which the geese are competitive, like coastal tidal flats and so forth. So it's a complex situation. But in the habitat of the Rocky Mountain mule deer, it clearly is the top dog in terms of herbivory. And there's also a pattern in the Northern Hemisphere in which each particular habitat type has only one main kind of deer. So general pattern in both Eurasia and North America is, show me a patch of habitat, whatever it is, savanna around the prairie belt, or boreal forest in the taiga zone, or the eastern deciduous woodlands, in any particular patch, or even up in the tundra where the caribou lives. Each particular patch will find one kind of deer. And it may overlap with another kind of deer around the edges, but this is a pattern that you do not find in the tropics, least of all in Africa. And so that deer is it. That deer has to be the main herbivore in its environment. And when you have a big seasonal flush, what you going to do with it? Because your females have just passed through a bottleneck in the winter, and there's only so many of them. And so the kind of environment that goes from winter shortage to summer abundance will go to waste in the summer unless an organism capitalizes on it in a kind of a luxury consumption kind of a way. And so the idea here is that, yes, the mule deer could neck wrestle like a nilgai, but given that it's the outlandish head adornments that we call antlers are affordable in that environment, the animal hoovers them up and uses them.
Yeah, and is muscling out the rodents and other grazers in the process as well. Coming back to the chital deer, is it possibly the case that it occupies a slightly different niche to the nilgai? It's got more resources available. It's perhaps on different soil types. Got a bit more energy available, and it's just muscling out by consuming more grass than it needs to. It's muscling out other grazers because that's a biological imperative, and it could just allow that grass to pass through its digestive tract undigested and just get well. It would need to digest it, otherwise there's some animal that's coming in, I suppose, to utilize the feces. But if it's digesting, if it's taking in the grass, might as well put it to some use and grow a head of antlers. Where's the mystery if one frames it like that? Yep, it's competing with other grazers and it's got more resources than it needs, and so it grows a head of antlers.
Well, the mystery is that in the chital environment, the environment of the spotted deer axis in India, there should be no excess resources. Simply because, although it's a monsoonal climate, it's not the same as a northern hemisphere temperate zone climate with not only a seasonal flush of herbaceous material, but a very high quality one. In the tropics, most of the soils in India are fairly poor. And although there is a monsoon alternating with a dry season, the systems are relatively frugal. And what you have in India is a kind of intergradation between antlered ruminants and non-antlered ruminants in a way that you do not see in the temperate zone in the northern hemisphere. And so India has coexistence between several kinds of deer with antlers and several kinds of bovids with just modest horns. And it's very difficult to sort out the habitats in the sense of figuring out why the chital is where it is, because the chital is widespread in India, as is the nilgai. The chital tends to be in slightly moister and more wooded environments, the nilgai more in slightly open and grassy environments. But it's not the case that the nilgai is more of a grazer. It's actually more of a browser. And it's very difficult to see a kind of a pattern within that Indian biota that explains something as radical as the difference in allocation of resources to head adornments in the nilgai versus the chital. So that's the problem. I spent some enthusiastic years many decades ago in life burrowing into the idea that in the tropics we would find that the deer are eating the more nutrient-rich plants, thus explaining why they can afford to grow antlers. Because as you may know, dicotyledonous leaves, whether they're on forbs or on woody plants, tend to be nutrient richer than grass, particularly considering that the grazer has to eat dry, brown, poor grass for some of the year in the dry season.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that idea didn't hold up to scrutiny, because I found that quite a lot of deer with perfectly respectable antlers, like the Barasinga in India, it's basically as well antlered as a red deer stag in Germany.
Yeah.
The Barasinga just eats dry grass in the winter, just like an antelope in nutrient poor savanna in Africa. Yeah. And so that whole idea fell through. It wasn't as if the Barasinga is a specialized browser. And the same is true for several other deer species. There are some deer species that are just simply grazers, and grass is pretty poor in nutrients. And so within the tropics, the fact that some antlers grow these extravagant, as we would say, prodigus antlers on a diet not much different from African bovids, or for that matter, some of the Indian bovids, is a profound puzzle in biology. How do they afford to do it, and what's the evolutionary incentive for them doing it, given that in Africa, across a wide range of latitudes, it's just simply a fauna of animals lacking antlers. It's really a puzzling biogeographical pattern.
Yeah, and looking closely at its the grazing or browsing competitors in those environments where deer are growing the antlers doesn't yield any pattern either.
Well, it does yield a pattern if you compare Africa with South America. There's quite a nice pattern, because the thing about South America is that it has exclusively deer. There's no indigenous bovids there, but the deer are rather scarce. There's no real dense populations of deer in South America as there are dense populations of bovids in Africa. But what you find in South America is that a lot of the herbage is taken by all kinds of rodents, from mouse size up to capybara size. And the capybara, which is a kind of a fill-in for an ungulate because it's definitely a herbivore, has an average body size of about 50 kilograms, and at the outside can grow to 90 kilograms in a big female. So you're talking about an ungulate size or deer size or antelope size rodent. And then you have KVs, and you have tucutucos, and you have coipus, and you have all kinds of essentially grazing rodents in South America that seem to have usurped the ruminants in being predominant herbivores on that continent. So one does need to look at the rodentiforms, but and in Africa, the rodentiforms are pretty restricted. Like, you'll have a cane rat, but only in certain reedy environments. And you'll have hares, lepus species, but they seem to fill in interstitially among the ruminants rather than ever being competitive. And so it is true that in Africa, the rodentiforms are relegated to very much a subsidiary role. But you see, none of this ultimately explains why the South American biota went that direction in the first place, towards excluding bovids, having mainly rodentiforms, and then having those ruminants that do occur belong to the Cervidae, the deer family, such that all of the indigenous ruminants in South America, other than the camelids, all grow antlers. So this profound, this is a latitudinally matched problem. So, both South America and Africa have extensive land masses in the tropics, and you have this categorical difference, most puzzling biogeographically, in which it's all bovids in the tropics, in the lowland tropics in Africa, and it's all cervids in America. So there's a categorical difference in their head adornments that seems to make no ecological sense, and basically spits in the face of the idea of evolutionary convergence. That's the puzzle.
Wonderful. I hope we can come up with a hypothesis for this at some point. What about India? Rodentia in India, in between Africa and South America, or closer to Africa, I would have thought.
I think it's closer to Africa. Yes, there's the black-naped hare, Lepus nigricollis, which is very similar to the kind of hare you'll see in the Kruger Park. And there are some grazing rodents, but it's much more similar to Africa. The rodentiforms are very much interstitial and subsidiary in India. So the fascinating thing about India is that against all the odds and against all logic, it has this almost equivalent weighting between the bovids on the one side and the cervids, the deer, on the other side. And so you see, the reason why that's important is somebody might say that the fundamental reason for the categorical difference between South America and Africa is that the bovids just happened not to have penetrated South America, based on this concept of formerly separate continents, then connected by an isthmus, which is like a faunal bottleneck that allowed certain animals through and not others. So you could possibly make a case that no bovid ever made it to South America. Personally, I don't buy that, but you could make out that argument. And if that's so, well, it's not going to puzzle you so much to find that there's no bovids in South America, and therefore all of the proper ruminants in South America, other than the camelids, have antlers. But in India, you can't come up with that kind of excuse at all, because the bovid and cervid faunas of India are profoundly integrated.
Mm.
You see, so right across India, you have both. You've got the Indian gazelle, you've got the black buck, you've got the gaur, you've got the four-horned antelope. These are all bovids. You've got the nilgai. And formerly you had the river buffalo, which is an extinct species of buffalo that's now found only in domesticated form. So you've got a decent fauna of bovids in India, ranging from about duiker size up to about 500 kilos or more, perhaps even a ton. And then on the other side, you've got quite a lot of deer species in India. You've got the sambar, you've got the manchak, you've got the chital, and you've got the barasinga. They're all deer, and they're all fairly widespread, or were so formerly. And how they interdigitate and coexist with these vastly different strategies, with the deer showing prodigousness, and the bovids not showing prodigousness, is one of the most delicious biogeographical puzzles in the world. And what astonishes me, Anthony, is that I was puzzled by this already many decades ago, and I kind of figured, well, if I didn't have the brains to solve it, somebody soon would. But I have to remark now in 2024 that nobody has ever even pointed this puzzle out, let alone tried to solve it. And that to me is a shocking indictment on biological curiosity, because it's just such a prime example of a fundamental ecological puzzle that has to be solved if we want to claim any real understanding of guild structure, competition, biological communities, adaptation to environments, and so on.
Yeah, perhaps a different way of framing it is, how is it possible that a frugal animal can be as competitive as a prodigus animal, occupying similar niches? Is that it in a nutshell?
Well, I mean, take the nilgai, the blue bull, Basilaphus tragocamelus in India, and compare it with the coexisting. Let's pick on the sambar, because it's more like the same size, because the chital is smaller. It's always nice to match body sizes in any comparison. Yeah. So the nilgai and the sambar deer, Rusa unicolor, are both widespread in India. They're kind of knockabout animals. They're found in many of the different little game reserves in India, and Indians who visit these parks don't really think too much of them except as tiger prey. They're just knockabout animals. One's an antelope kind of animal, and the other one's a deer kind of animal. But they're both widespread Indian animals, and the nilgai has negligible horns, restricted to the male, and even in the male, shorter than its rather short ears. Whereas the sambar has very respectable and particularly hard and heavy antlers. And it sheds them and regrows them every year, just like every other deer. And so in the, say, 15-year lifetime of a male sambar, it'll shed a little tree on the left and on the right of its head every year until it dies. And so what the sambar uses in its lifetime of growing head adornments is orders of magnitude. Anything up to 3 orders of magnitude, maybe more, different in terms of phosphorus, calcium, protein, energy, and so on. And there's no big difference in the habitats or even in the foraging ecology of these animals. The sambar may graze more than a nilgai. The sambar may prefer slightly more wooded habitat. The sambar might be slightly more water dependent, but they both just live in the woodlands and savannas of India. And so your question is with respect to the prodigousness. How does it all work out? Well, it's simply the case that the nilgai has adopted a form of male rivalry that does not require prodigousness. It just simply neck wrestles. It's eminently sensible. We should take that as the obvious and default solution to the problem, rather than something odd. I mean, people regard the neck wrestling of the nilgai as rather odd and suspected to be primitive, but actually it should be the default setting, in the sense that why
Yeah.
wouldn't you neck wrestle? Because it's the parsimonious thing to do. Why bother to grow trees on your head? Whereas the sambar, in ostensibly the same environment, subject to the same predators, with even a similar social and gregarious system and comparable body size, has this exorbitant, what we call prodigus strategy of male rivalry. And that makes so little sense. I don't even know where to begin with it. It's just it's a flagrant biological puzzle.
So to
particularly
bring it back,
India.
Fascinating. And to bring it back to ATP, is it not possible that the nilgai is expending as much ATP on the neck wrestling as the sambar deer is on growing antlers? Because it's all about, I don't think we've explained to listeners that, the antlers and the neck wrestling are all about sexual selection and trying to attract mates, and the females are using both the neck wrestling and the antlers as signals for male fitness. They, of course, want the fittest male for their offspring for all sorts of reasons, often for reasons that you can't see, like an immune system to fend off rapidly evolving bacteria and other parasites. So, do we know how much ATP is being used in neck wrestling versus antler building?
Well, nobody's measured it, but just general observation of these animals indicate they're both pretty ardent in their male rivalry. They put a lot of energy into sparring from youth onwards. So they're both energetic sparers. There's one possible clue, Anthony, and that is that in terms of body size, sexual dimorphism, the nilgai has the advantage over the sambar. Let me explain. In the nilgai, a bit like in its relatives, the kudu and the eland of Africa, the males are considerably more massive than the females, with a different body proportion in which the four quarters are more emphasized. So a male nilgai looks a bit disproportionate. He's like heavily biased towards the four quarters, whereas the female is a fairly average-looking antelope. So there seems to be more somatic investment in the nilgai, allowing him to be a masterful neck wrestler. He's taken the emphasis off the horns and more into his four-quarter musculature.
Right.
Whereas in the sambar, there's much less sexual dimorphism. Males of the sambar are more massive than the females, but the difference in the bodies is not that striking. The main difference is in the head adornments, because female sambar have no antlers at all, whereas males have quite impressive antlers. And so a possible solution is that they are indeed both using lots of protein and even calcium and phosphorus for the bony structures. But what the nilgai is doing is investing that in the male in somatic structures, particularly the four quarters and the neck, whereas the sambar is retaining a more or less equivalent overall physiognomy to his female, but is instead manifesting his impressive masculinity in the form of this prodigus pair of antlers. Now, the obvious question that raises is, shouldn't we be looking at the male nilgai and regarding his brawny forequarters as prodigus? Well, maybe we should. Maybe that's the key, is to see that the brawny forequarters of the nilgai are actually prodigus. But that's kind of hard to grok, because from our human point of view, it's less noticeable to us that an animal has rather brawny forequarters than that this creature is growing trees out of its head every year.
It's just a wonderful topic. And perhaps we need we almost certainly need another podcast to venture into humans. But, thinking about nilgai versus sambar deer, in humans, would you say there's an interesting analogy with the billionaire who drives around in a cheap car versus the mafioso boss who drives around in a Mazerati? Is there the one looks prodigus, the other doesn't?
Yes, well, this is a complex topic, as you say, and we won't do it justice here, but I think we can tantalize listeners by pointing out that this topic of prodigusness, while interesting in its own right in nature, affects deeply our human condition, because everybody knows about, male advertisement in the human species, about status, about materialism, about showy possessions, about all sorts of status symbols, many of which are only effective because they are extravagant and expensive. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, to what degree is this sort of behavior in humans simply a biological phenomenon in line with the prodigousness that we've explained in deer antlers? And to what degree is it beyond biology and more in the moral realm? Because the difference between a Ferrari-owning playboy and a male sambar deer is that the male sambar deer only has a biological reality and not a moral reality. You can never accuse a male sambar deer of being sinfully wasteful of resources by diverting resources to his antlers instead of allowing the females of his population to put those same molecules of phosphorus, for example, into milk for their young. We can make that criticism as humans, but we can't assume any moral aspect to the deer's life. Whereas in humans, it's both prodigousness and something else, which is profligacy. And as we'll explain in a subsequent podcast, we need this clear term, profligacy, in humans. We don't have to invent the term because it's already in the dictionary. But in humans, we have both prodigousness, which is a showy expenditure of resources for dubious causes, as it were, like a Ferrari. And we also have profligacy. And profligacy is defined essentially as immoral prodigiousness, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Profligacy is the domain of humans. Yeah.
Right. But I don't think the word dubious fits with the word prodigousness. So
No, exactly. Yes. I was. Yeah. The moment I said that, I was aware that I was mangling language there. Yeah.
So the purchase of a Ferrari can be seen as prodigus, just simply part of the biological game of attracting mates. But if we see it as profligate, then we see the purchase as potentially of a dubious nature as far as morals go.
Well, that's right. And in humans, this is important because given the fossil fuel base that we enjoy in modern industrial and post-industrial societies, what might have been understandable and tolerable prodigiousness in our Aboriginal condition becomes potentially lethal, because we can have people who are so powerful politically that their expression of their status, their expression of what was originally prodigiousness, can turn out to be extremely hazardous for nations, for populations, and maybe even for the world in the form of nuclear arms. Given the political power of the military-industrial complex and so on. And so there's a real moral dimension to this kind of extravagance in humans, which makes it more important that we understand clearly the biological reality of prodigiousness before we go on to the human realm and start to make moral judgments, as we must, because eventually we have to have a conceptual framework that's robust enough that we can start to make moral judgments in the human realm. But until we've got a fundamental standard, as it were, that's based on other animals that do not have morality, we can't really enter the human arena and think clearly.
Yeah, what strikes me, Anthony, is that by creating this word prodigus and prodigusness, the words, we are giving power to the word profligate and profligacy.
That's right.
Because it becomes clearer in terms of what it means. Would you agree?
I agree with that. Now, let's take a three-step thought experiment. There's a sambar deer. There's an Aboriginal human living 120,000 years ago, a completely biologically modern Homo sapiens, but living on extremely simple resources and with negligible or rudimentary technical prowess. And then you have some CEO in the military-industrial complex whose profit basis is waging war on a vast scale with the risk of nuclear escalation and conflagration. So the first two are cases of simple prodigiousness, even though a human is involved in one, because in the Stone Age, no matter what a man's masculine aspirations might have been, and no matter how intense the rivalry might have been to give him a status in his community and to allow him to pick the best wives, there's only so much that he could do that was of a damaging nature. And so, although he was a human, he was still firmly in the realm of prodigiousness because he simply didn't have the means to be profligate, given that the word profligate is based on a Latin root ligere, which means to inflict. You see, the antlers of a sambar deer don't inflict anything. They certainly spend something, but they don't inflict harm on the species.
Yeah.
And similarly, an Aboriginal human living 120,000 years ago couldn't inflict anything really on his population, on the world, and so on by being a flagrant spender because he didn't have the means to do it. But in the modern world, with fossil fuel, with political complexity, with the immense power dynamics that go on, you can actually have a situation where the world goes up in a nuclear holocaust simply because certain actors within the system were allowing their natural prodigiousness to morph into a lethally harmful profligacy.
Yeah.
And that's why morality is essential for us in humans, because unless we rein in what started out as prodigiousness, but easily morphs into profligacy, then we'll find ourselves hung on our own petard, as it were.
Yeah, and trying to figure out where acceptable prodigousness turns into profligacy is a delicious question. You know, is one Mazerati in the basement profligacy, or is it 20 and some yachts in the bay, all belonging to one individual, or does profligacy only really kick in when someone's got their finger over a nuclear button and has all this power? Where do you draw the line between acceptable biological prodigiousness and unacceptable immoral profligacy?
Well, I think that line has to be drawn according to sustainability. You see, you could look at a sambar deer and criticize it. You could say, well, okay, that you shed and regrow your antlers every year, you know, that's a bit extravagant, but we'll let you off. Keep doing that because we'll just call it, you know, prodigiousness. And then the sambar deer decides to have 2 tines on each antler instead of just 1. That's a bit excessive. Wouldn't 1 do? I mean, all the antelopes have just 1. And then you find that the sambar deer has 4 tines on each antler. So it's growing little trees on each side of the head that have got 4 different branches. And you think, well, you know, you're going over the top here, mate. You know, but you see, the reason why we don't make moral judgments there is because the very fact of the sambar deer continuing to exist for millions of years shows you that it is sustainable. We don't understand the resource budget involved, so we can't explain how it's sustainable, particularly relative to the nilgai. But what we can say is that it's axiomatically sustainable, and so we can't make a moral judgment. Sambar are not about to put themselves out of business or go extinct because of their extravagance in growing antlers. Right. Yeah. And with humans as well, if it were the case that you had an economy that was based soundly, that didn't, transgress some fundamental rules of indebtedness and corruption of money and so on, and was a rich but sustainable fossil fuel-based economy in which a certain proportion of the males could sustainably be quite flagrant in their resource allocation for a social and sexual agenda, then again the issue of morality is moot because, well, if it's sustainable, then how can you criticize it any more than you can criticize the deer? Yeah. But we have long gone into a realm in human affairs where there's every evidence that it's not sustainable, if only because the ultimate culmination of this kind of tendency is to risk planetary annihilation. And so the morality comes in at the point where you deem, and it's a hard thing to know objectively where to deem it, that we're now in unsustainable territory. Is one Ferrari unsustainable? I don't know. But the kind of flagrant expenditure of resources we're seeing in the world today is almost certainly unsustainable for one or other or a combination of reasons.
Yeah. I think it's unlikely that 8 billion people on the planet, go call it 4 billion pairs, having 4 billion Mazeratis on the planet is unlikely to be a sustainable setup through time. Yeah.
But you see, that's true. But even a few, because of the Pareto principle, even a few may be unsustainable. Because the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so the few people who really are top dogs in the world, who can command billions of dollars, they actually spend for the rest of us. And so even though they only form a small proportion of the population, they can actually threaten the whole population because the means that they have at their disposal for profligacy is so enormous.
Right. Yeah. So 99% of people can have ox wagons, donkey carts, and just 1% having Mazeratis is potentially still very dangerous. Yeah.
Well, that's the way that the world is going right now. The general economic trend in the world is for a dichotomy to be exacerbated between the have-nots and the haves. And so you can have both situations going on concurrently. The working and lower middle classes are getting poorer every year, whereas the rich are getting richer, and therefore they bring a moral hazard with them that's probably unprecedented in biological history, because no species has ever had a situation where it was so powerful energetically that its original, quite natural and justifiable tendency to spend resources on showing off has now become basically malignant.
Yeah.
That's where we are.
And that's perhaps why revolutions have happened through time, where the have-nots have gone at the haves with arms. But perhaps one needs to go at the haves with this concept of profligacy as well, and appeal to their logic in terms of needing to rein in the profligacy as an alternative strategy to taking them out with a revolution, which is what humans have done through time.
Yes, well, I suppose the objective way to approach this whole topic is to criticize people based on arguments of sustainability.
Yeah.
And I realize that opens up a whole new can of worms, because who actually knows what's sustainable and what's not? But any moral censure of human profligacy has to be based on a sustainability concept. Otherwise, it's just arbitrary. To criticize a Ferrari owner because you don't like the fact that he's showing off.
Yeah.
And you don't like his natural inborn genetic prodigiousness. That doesn't really hold water, because essentially, in biological terms, a libidinous man showing off a Ferrari is no different biologically from a sambar deer showing off 5 tines on each side of his antler pair.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to criticize there. But if you can make an argument that the Ferrari comes at the cost of all of us, in other words, that it's truly profligate in the sense of inflicting, afflicting, or conflicting with human welfare, now you have an argument. However difficult that argument may be to make, it's a categorically different kind of conceptual framework from the deer. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we need further podcasts to take this theorizing further.
Well, that's right. And in the meantime, let's encourage listeners to think deeply about various forms of prodigousness in nature, including the peacock's tail. That's another classic example that has long puzzled evolutionary biologists from Darwin's time onwards. It's a bit easier to understand than deer antlers, because deer antlers are so dynamic and complex that one has to do a fair bit of reading even to understand what they are. But a peacock's tail is a simpler example, because it's just another obvious example of prodigiousness. Why on earth would a male peacock grow such an outlandish tail, given that so many other phasianid birds, such as francolins, don't have any noticeable sexual dimorphism at all, and yet they reproduce and they function perfectly well? So peafowl are a classic example of prodigiousness.
Mm, mm. We need to come up with a theory along the same lines as the nilgai. The nilgai has this potential somatic investment in the forequarters, etc. How do the other francolins and pheasants relate in comparison? Is there any somatic difference between those animals and the peacock?
Well, that's right. And I'll also leave listeners with a tantalizing and provoking thought based on a visit to Sri Lanka that I enjoyed several years ago. I actually watched with my own eyes in a Sri Lankan national park a peafowl strutting past a leopard at short range. We first spotted the leopard. It was in the shade of a bush, but in view. And then a group of peafowl came walking past easily within striking range. And the leopard didn't bat an eye. It didn't even, yeah. And from that moment onwards, I realized that I don't understand the peafowl. And this whole idea that, the peafowl's prodigiousness is puzzling in terms of predation by tiger and leopard, that may not hold up, because as far as I can see, that leopard was profoundly uninterested in those peafowl. I don't know why, I don't know how, but I watched it with my own eyes. That leopard could easily have taken out at least one of that group that was sauntering by unconcerned within striking range. And surely some other biologist visiting India or Sri Lanka has come up with a similar observation. Surely somebody has noticed that peafowl seem immune to predation, at least from big cats. Why that is so, I have no idea. But that puts a whole new complexion on the assumption that the peafowl's tail has a fundamental cost in terms of predation. It may not.
Right. Did the males put their tails up in response to the leopard?
Not at all. The peafowls were completely uninterested in the leopard, although it was in plain view of them, and the leopard was profoundly uninterested in the peafowl. And this was all. I think that the peafowl were maybe 10 meters ahead of a crouching leopard. Well, it wasn't crouching as much as just resting in the shade, but it was easily visible under the crown of the bush. I mean, we were actually gawking at it. We were gawking at it as a leopard. And then we saw this group of peafowl coming from the right. I think about 6 of them, mainly females. And we thought any minute now they're going to spot the leopard and get out of here in the most frantic hurry. And nothing like that happened. They just carried on walking nonchalantly right in full view of the leopard. And the leopard, it didn't yawn, but it was profoundly uninterested. And the whole thing just drifted past us. And then we sat there scratching our heads saying, what the hell was that about?
Yeah, when a porcupine walks past and a leopard ignores the porcupine, you get it.
Yeah,
those
that's
quills.
Right. Well, even then you ain't so sure. Because leopards and lions love to attack porcupines. It's just that they often get kind of frustrated in the attempt, but they often succeed, actually.
Yeah.
They surprisingly often succeed. And they're prepared to take injuries to succeed.
Yeah.
So, it's not even a good analogy, because a porcupine is much more vulnerable to a leopard than the inference that I have to draw from what I observed on this one occasion.
Yeah. Is a honey badger a bit better? They'll also attack a honey badger, but I think it's the only young leopards that really go for honey badgers.
It's hard to know how a leopard would respond to a honey badger sauntering past. I can't predict it, but with this peafowl, it was almost as if the peafowl was deadly poisonous and everybody knew it. That's the way it behaved, and yet there's nothing in the literature or in its coloration or anything that I know about it that indicates that it has that kind of immunity. But if you were to imagine what it would look like when a group of birds that are deadly poisonous walk within 10 meters of a leopard, that's the way it unfolded.
Okay.
And I saw this with my own eyes. I can't unsee it.
Wonderful. When n equals 1 is actually significant.
Well, yes, anecdotes as a biologist that we're both familiar with is wont to say, anecdotes are underrated. Anecdotes have got a bad name, but actually anecdotes are important in natural history. They are.
Well, that's a fantastic anecdote to end on. I hadn't heard that one, Anthony. Thanks. And look forward to picking up on it in future podcasts, probably podcasts dedicated to peafowl as well as Mazeratis, even separate podcasts on those topics.
Yes, peafowl and Mazeratis. That has a certain ring to it, yes.
Great. Enjoy your afternoon there in Perth.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and to listeners, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for joining us here at Exploring the Bio-Edge, and we look forward to seeing you for our next item. And over and us from here for now.
Ciao.